Dr. Marino is from the Indiana Historical Bureau, a division of the Indiana State Library. And Hannah Easton and, Hannah Murphy and Easton Phillips come to us from Connor Prairie in Fishers, Indiana. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We'd like to know more about you. We're going to put a couple of links into the chat. We have a Google document that we're just wanting to know more about you. Where are you joining us from? So just please, if you wouldn't mind sharing your name, your institution, and then also on the form, we're asked if you are interested in joining any of our AIM committees. So let us know if you're interested in any of those. You can stay connected in the AIM community by signing up for our newsletter that comes out monthly, and also with reminders for whenever we do our AIM to Connect sessions. You can find us online. We have our Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, and those recorded sessions, like in today, you'll see soon pop up on our YouTube channels. You can visit our website at inmuseums.org/resources to get some additional information. Or if you just have a question that you can't find off of our website or any other place, just give us an email, Indiana Museums, or our Gmail account, indianamuseums@gmail.com. Okay. Thank you for allowing me to promote ourselves a little bit there, but you all turned in to hear about Podcasting 101. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Michelle Marino from the Indiana Historical Bureau.
Thank you, Carrie. And I want to first apologize to everyone who joined today thinking that it was going to be Jill. I have brought the cool factor down significantly without her being here. And so my apologies on that. But I am happy and pleased to be able to talk about our podcast, Talking Hoosier History. So if you'd give me just a second here to share my screen and get going. So I am Dr. Michelle Marino, and I am the Deputy Director of the Indiana Historical Bureau, and we are a division of the Indiana State Library. I have been with the Bureau since the summer of 2018. Our podcast actually started a year before that, which is why I wanted Jill to present today, as she has been a key part of it, the producer from the very beginning, but I'll do my best to fill in gaps where I can. But like I said, I've been with the Bureau for 5 years, and in those 5 years, there's been a lot of changes in our programming and staffing and who's been involved in the podcast, but it's still going strong. And I'd like to talk today sort of about our own process of thinking about the podcast and where we have failed and things that you might want to consider as well if you're thinking about doing a podcast. So a little bit about the Bureau. If you are not familiar with us, we actually evolved from the Indiana Historical Commission, which was created in 1915 to plan the celebration of the statehood centennial. We were our own agency for over 100 years, and then in the summer of 2017 merged with the Indiana State Library, which we had always shared space with and partnered with. And so now the Bureau is composed of the public history folks, which have always been involved in the Bureau, digital initiatives department, and also the rare books and manuscripts department of the library. So in terms of our mission and what we have been doing for well over 100 years and how that fits in with the library as well, is that the Historical Bureau has been tasked with providing publications, programs, and other opportunities for Indiana citizens of all ages to learn and teach about the history of their communities, the state of Indiana, and our relationships to the nation and the world. So we sort of consider ourselves like a public history think tank, if you will. We're a public history department where we undertake academic, primary source research, and then sort of translate that and produce stories for a general audience, right? Keeping in mind the sort of shared authority piece that we don't just want this to be top-down history. We want ideas to come from the public and partner with the public regularly on all of our programming. History relevance is also at the core of what we do and has been for quite some time. So we want to work with Hoosiers to create history that impacts their identity, their community, engages people in critical thinking about sources and assumptions, and creates engaged citizenship. While history is important for history alone, it's interesting, right? If you cannot explain why it is important today and why it is relevant, then we don't think that that's particularly useful in today's climate. So we very much do promote this idea of history relevance. So to actually get to the podcast, which I promise I will do, we actually first have to talk about our state historical marker program. We have been tasked by the Indiana General Assembly to manage the state historical marker program. We have approximately 750 markers in 91 of Indiana's 92 counties. Jay County is our last holdout. I'm always desperately asking folks to come up with a topic from Jay County. And our topics for our markers range from art to politics to science to sports, a little bit of everything in between. But our marker program is actually a public-driven program, so anyone can submit an application on any topic as long as it has statewide significance and or national significance, and as long as sort of each point on the marker can be verified by primary sources and meet some of our other criteria. For instance, if someone, we don't do a marker for a person unless they have been deceased for at least 20 years. There's a handful of other sort of criteria like that. But our marker program has been around since 1946. And so we know that a lot of our older markers from the 40s through the 60s can often be problematic. So this is also problematic, if we're going to use the term there. But particularly our markers that have been dealing with or ignoring Indigenous history. So I want to talk more as I go through today about those particular issues and how we're trying to address some of these issues from our marker program also within our own podcast. So why do state markers, and again, I do promise I'm getting to the podcast piece in this, but you know, while a cast aluminum sign with limited text space can seem really like an outdated mode of history or an outdated format, or maybe not a great way to deal with nuanced history, it can also be really powerful, especially when they're used to return stories about marginalized communities to the landscape, right? A landscape where perhaps structures weren't valued or preserved by white colonizing groups in power. We also know that markers can help people tell their own stories. Communities come to us to tell, to let us know which stories that they think are important and which stories to tell. So we work as partners through the program. And we've had success also guiding applicants to telling more inclusive stories as well. So a final note on markers here real quick. Unlike like statues, for instance, markers are not celebratory. We deal with very difficult topics like eugenics, the Klan, slavery, lynching, subjects that are especially important to be recognized by the state in this instance, which has often had a role in maintaining these types of practices and environments. So if you want to know more about the marker program or look into particular topics, please visit our website and you can click through by topic or by our map or county. So why I have already spent so much time today on markers, because our marker program is actually a foundation for all our other projects, including our podcast. And I want to show you how a podcast can fit in with your organization's mission in that particular way. So IHB has only 5 employees that are working on markers, along with a lot of other projects. So we don't have a lot of extra time, but our mission does include publishing. So we use the COPE philosophy, which is create once, publish everywhere. And so because we do so much primary research for historical markers, we often come across stories that don't make it into the brief marker text, right? We have like 370 characters for each side of a marker. We're like the original Twitter, essentially. So we have to eliminate a lot of things for markers. So we use other formats then, particularly our Indiana history blog, which you see here on our screen, to tell these other stories or to tell a fuller story or more rich picture than what we can just get on the marker. So for example, some Carroll County residents wanted to replace a damaged historical marker that was created in the 1960s, which was telling the story of a small section of the Michigan Road that was lined with sycamore trees. And they felt that this area and the trees that they lovingly maintained, sort of tangentially connect them to their past. However, we know that the Potawatomi who originally stewarded that land were removed through unjust legal practices, military pressure, and genocide. So we work with stakeholders to briefly include mention of the Potawatomi on this replacement marker. And that was more than what the applicants perhaps wanted and less than what we wanted, but objectively just not the whole story, right? So we turned to the blog and then also the podcast and other things to say more, to provide more nuance to the stories, including eyewitness accounts to the genocide. So I obviously encourage you to also check out our blog and check out these other diverse stories that are there, and let us know also what you want to know more about. But now, the podcast. So how did we decide that we needed a podcast? And what questions should you be asking yourself if you're thinking if this is right for your organization? So absolutely, the first question should be, will this help us achieve our mission and goals, right? And if so, like, go for it. Great, maybe this is a great option for you. But if you're not sure, a podcast or even a blog or an exhibit or some other project like this, a big project really, can just stretch you too thin and then contribute to mission creep, right? So what is the point of why we're doing this? But for us here at the Bureau, the answer was a big yes. Yes, this absolutely contributed to our mission and being able to tell more Hoosier stories. And we had a lot of stories that we felt deserved to be told, right? We already had the research. So choosing the podcast for us was more a matter of picking a format to tell the stories than it was actually adding a new project, right? So if the podcast builds on and enhances your goals, then yes, I would say that that is a great fit, right? Second, is there an open sort of niche for what you're wanting to do? Is there a demand or a gap that needs to be filled? So for instance, obviously the Historical Society, which I saw some folks here today for that, in the State Museum, do fantastic exhibits. Prairie, Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site are destinations. There are things there for people to go see. But IHB, we are a little office full of just historians working on markers, really, and we can't be all of these other big things necessarily, nor do we have the money to do so. But we do have a staff of really talented historians that include, that have really excellent writing skills, oratory skills, and production skills, which is a key point. So we felt that we could create a lively narrative podcast about Indiana history. And I think the narrative piece for us, which is different than sort of what Hannah and Easton are going to be talking about, was one at the time when we started the podcast back in 2017 that no one else was really doing at the time. And I think that's still true in terms of just the narrative format. And so what I mean by that is, we write a script that's telling a story. We use music, sound effects, and sound bites to enhance that story, like a sort of documentary for your ears. So if you can bear with me here for just a second, I am going to try to play just a beginning clip of one of our podcasts. And I want to make sure here that I'm sharing my sound, which I believe I am. So this is an episode we did last year called The Dutiful Dozen on the South Bend Blue Sox. That was part of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So just to get a sense of sort of what these sound like on our end, I'll go ahead and play just the first few seconds of our podcast. And if someone would give me a thumbs up if you can in fact hear this.
And we're all tied up here at one apiece as we head to the bottom of the 10th. The Blue Sox need to put one across to keep their championship hopes alive. We've got something cooking here. Runners on the corners now with 2 out. Can they do it again, folks? Westerman up at the plate with a chance to win it. And there's a liner smashed to the right side, and it's through! Ladies and gentlemen, as they've proven time and again, don't count these Sox out yet. We've got ourselves a tied series, and we'll see you tomorrow for the championship.
Take me out to the ball game.
So that's just a little snippet. I'd love to play the next 2 minutes because we definitely worked in a quote from Tom Hanks in A League of Their Own there, but alas, we are short on time. So but that gives you the sense of how we're like working these different elements into the podcast itself. So let me go one more slide here. So in terms of our podcast, we started back in 2016. And again, this was before I was here at the Bureau, but our first episodes came out in 2017 and early 2017. And right away, the folks working on the podcast understood that we needed to check back in sort of periodically to see if this still fit with our mission. We were telling diverse stories based in primary source research, but were we really sharing authority, which is sort of the key piece for us in terms of our marker program, everything we do, and really the public history field as a whole, right? So we had been checking in with experts on the topics that we were covering, but what about the people in the communities we were covering? Were we actually encouraging and developing critical thinking skills, which is a key part of our mission and history relevance as well. So I want to start here for a minute with this critical thinking piece. We had decided to add more sections and even entire episodes like the Lincoln one that's pictured here in the middle, where we sort of pull back the curtain on the historical process. So we're not just sharing these really interesting stories from Indiana history, but we want people to know how history is done, right? What is the historical process? So how do we question evidence? How do we interpret and even revise history, right? Because that's actually not a dirty word. That's a key part of the history process, is revising conclusions. So for our Lincoln episode, this is one where we examined various myths, contradictory information, and then showed listeners how we could argue that Lincoln achieved his greatness because of his Hoosier roots. And then we turned around and with the same documentation argued that his achievements were in spite of his Hoosier Indiana roots, right? So an exercise in sort of critical thinking about how you can interpret the evidence. But that really is still a top-down approach that we were doing, right? We weren't necessarily sharing authority with some of these episodes. So we had the idea to add the literal voice of people from the communities that were relevant to the topics when appropriate. And that sounds right on paper, like, yeah, that's a great thing to do, right? But it actually wasn't always effective. So for example, in one episode, we wanted to re-examine the often told story about Robert F. Kennedy announcing the murder of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King to a mostly Black audience in Indianapolis. And Kennedy's speech is often given credit for preventing violence in Indianapolis that had occurred in other cities across the nation. But in reality, Kennedy is not the key figure there, right? It was the strong and united Black leadership of Indianapolis that led the community in peaceful mourning. So we wanted to include in this episode the words of King, of course, for context, and we were able to do so using historical audio clips, which was good. But even more importantly, for this story, we needed to use the words of our Black Hoosier leaders, which were not recorded. So it did not feel right to us to use a white reader or a white voice actor. So we reached out to Dr. Frank Thomas, who's a preacher, a professor, and an advocate for moral imagination, who had studied Kennedy's speech. And that was a perfect pairing for that episode, right? Like, not only did Dr. Thomas perform the words of Black leaders for the narrative, but he then sat down with us for an interview that we were able to include at the end of that podcast episode. So we felt like by forming those partnerships that we were sharing authority and giving voice to others with more direct connections to an expertise in the area that we were looking at as historians, right? So we grew this idea into a separate section of the podcast called Giving Voice. So from here on out, from that point on out, for each topic, we created a narrative episode of Talking Hoosier History, and then conducted an interview with someone with a different perspective on that same issue for a shorter Giving Voice episode. And in some cases, that was really powerful. We heard from people from like the Black resort community, Fox Lake, talk about what it was like growing up there. We asked scholars to debunk myths associated with certain topics. We talked to colleagues who had different and even opposing ideas and conclusions than we had. We've also talked to activists about building support coalitions of Black, Jewish, LGBTQ plus folks in the ongoing fight for civil rights. After the Ryan White episode, we talked to someone at the Department of Health about their work to eliminate HIV by 2030. So for us, Giving Voice sort of checked that shared authority in including diverse voices box. But at the same time, were we actually acting ethically? And this is not a hypothetical question. We are still asking it as we move forward through our podcast as well. So after a two-part narrative on the Shawnee leader Tenskwatawa, for instance, this is one of our most downloaded episodes. We did 2 episodes of Giving Voice, an interview. One was an interview with the director of the Agawam Educational Initiative on the importance of including Indigenous voices and sources and decolonizing historical institutions. And then we also talked with Chief Ben Barnes of the Shawnee Nation of Indiana. And so we had worked for a long time on these 2 narrative episodes and then shelved them for quite a while. We worked with indigenous musicians on music for the episode, which we felt really good about and really enhanced the story. But despite approaching numerous Indigenous contacts, no one wanted to be the voice actor for this particular episode. Some folks had agreed, but then sort of went quiet on us and we couldn't get back in touch with them. And we had these 2 really well-researched episodes using a mix of both Indigenous and scholarly sources, but no local Indigenous buy-in. And that was really problematic, right? So first, no matter how hard we're trying, we're still the state. We are the state, right? Our own marker program has misrepresented or ignored Indigenous history. We're not shying away from that truth or reality. We have done harm and have not done a complete inventory of that harm or worked to fix it necessarily. Second, now that we've decided to try to work in sort of small ways at doing better and telling Indigenous stories with Indigenous people, we're still putting our labor on them. So we do not have the money to compensate them for revisiting traumas and historical injustices in order to serve as voice actors for our podcast episode. So is this even ethical? How do we move forward with this? So we know that it's not ethical. So Giving Voice was well-intentioned, but still very problematic for us. So yes, we need to fix our marker program, which is our flagship program, before we ask for Indigenous people to get on board. But what do we do in the meantime? Right? Do we not tell Indigenous stories? Are we then contributing, though, to further erasure of that history if we're not doing it at all? Or are we being responsible, recognizing that we're perhaps not the right people for this episode or this story, right, to do that history? And honestly, I don't have the answers to that. These are questions that we are asking ourselves and still grappling with as well. And they're big questions and very important ones that I think people need to think about before they begin pursuing, and even as they go through a podcast or what have you. So, I've covered some successes and failures already with our podcast, but in general, I think you're on the right track when members of the communities you're telling these histories of are enthusiastically on board. You're not taking from them, you're again engaging in that shared authority piece. So for instance, just a couple of important ones to mention, Jill's rabbi and cantor were really excited to help her tell the story of Rabbi Maurice's Davis's civil rights work. So Jill wrote that episode for the podcast and then did the Giving Voice interviews as well. And again, had that shared authority buy-in. So they were really happy to talk with her and excited to talk with her about Black Jewish coalitions to continue the work for civil rights and what that looks like today. So again, getting back to the history relevance piece for us in terms of the face of ongoing violence in both communities. Another one to mention was the mayor of Gary was eager to contribute to the telling of the story of the 1972 National Black Political Convention, and librarians of LGBTQ+ oral histories were happy to share those records with us and have them be included in episodes about queer Hoosiers protesting conservative homophobic spokesperson Anita Bryant. So I would say that the major failure is that while Giving Voice feels to us like a win, it feels like we're giving voice back to the communities, right? The statistics also show us otherwise. people are not downloading these episodes, right? They're not getting great traction for us. So we are sort of speaking into the void with these episodes. And that means, though, that we are asking LGBTQ plus Black, Jewish, Indigenous people to deal with difficult topics and donate their labor back to us with no return on their end, right? These aren't getting the traction that we were hoping they were, and that's not really okay either. So we're always looking for new audiences. And again, reevaluating, is this something we want to continue with? Is it working for us? Is it meeting our mission? And also not putting undue labor and burdens on the communities whose stories we're hoping to get out there. So one way that we are thinking about reevaluating is answering the calls of teachers, which we have heard over the past couple of years for shorter episodes that they can use in the classroom. So my husband, for instance, is a teacher at Shortridge High School, and he would not make his students sit down and listen to a 20-minute 30-minute episode because they're just not going to do it as high school students. They're simply not. But they will do, several minute engaging slices of an episode that they can then discuss and analyze. So we are later this year launching a series of Talking Hoosier History shorts, clocking in at about 7 to 10 minutes, along with lesson plans that are more readily tailored to that particular audience. And then in 2024, we're going to consider a more extreme overhaul, perhaps even like an investigation on one complex topic or an entire season in which we include diverse voices like at each step of the podcast instead of sort of segregating them to a separate segment itself, right? So I've just spoke a lot on sort of the ups and downs of Talking Hoosier History and how we've evolved. And I know that there's more we can talk about in terms of just like platforms and software and things. I know Hannah and Easton are going to get into that a little bit. But sort of what I want to leave you with here with my time, and I'm happy to talk more in question and answer, is simply encouraging you before you dive into a podcast, or even as you're going through your own podcast, to continue to ask the hard questions. Who are you serving? Is that doing good or is that doing harm? And also thinking about reevaluating your own podcast. It doesn't have to stay stagnant, right? And nor should it, as your organization evolves or as the missions evolve themselves. So sort of stay tuned to where we're going with our own podcast, and I'm happy to talk more later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. And next on our speakers for today, I'd like to introduce Hannah Murphy and Easton Phillips, coming to us from Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and they are the co-hosts of Conner Prairie's podcast titled "This is Problematic."
I'm Hannah, and
I'm Easton. Nice to see you all.
And we host the This is Problematic podcast up here at Conner Prairie. So similar to Michelle, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about who we are and what Conner Prairie does, and then we'll go into a little bit about the podcast itself, similarly successes and failures. And I think we were having some audio difficulties. We wanted to say how much we enjoyed Michelle's presentation, and thank you for getting us started.
All right, so just an intro to who we are. So my name is Easton Phillips. I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. I graduated from the University of Cincinnati in spring of 2021. So I graduated with a major in history, a minor in anthropology, and a certificate in international human rights. And as I was writing my senior capstone, I was already in talks with our wonderful boss, Dr. Charlene Fletcher, and got added to the Conner Prairie curatorial department. So we're now in the department. I'm a research associate. That's my official title.
Can I just show her one quick thing? Yes, you're presenting to
Mom, you're unmuted. There you go. Love you. Okay, so sorry about that. Yes, so we are as a research associate. Yes, research associate in the Department of Curatorial Affairs here, and that's our primary jobs. So the podcast kind of got added on as an introduction and introduced together with our job that I share with Hannah.
Yeah, so I'm Hannah Murphy. I also have a background in history. I'm currently, as well as working here at Conner Prairie in the curatorial department as a research associate. I came on board about the same time as Easton. I am also an MA MLIS student joint degree at IUPUI in MA Public History and then Library Sciences. So we both have that historical background. Okay, we can talk a little bit about where we're coming from. As we said, I think a couple times now, we do work up here at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, often recognized for our beautiful balloon. We put up a little picture of that, but our mission and our vision and everything we do is so much more. Our mission is, we put it here, is that we are a unique historic place that inspires curiosity and fosters learning by providing engaging and individualized experiences for everyone. So in beginning to think about the idea of a podcast, it was brought to us by our boss when we first started this position, Dr. Charlene Fletcher, as a conversation that had been ongoing within the institution of if a podcast felt like a good format for Conner Prairie to be engaging in. It made sense as we kind of worked through the conversation of what our podcast here could be about, could focus on, that it would come from primarily a historical place, a place of historical inquiry and critical thinking. And so obviously having that unique historic place in there, that is what grounds all of the work we do here. What we really realized was a component that I think all institutions struggle with, and is definitely something that we have been grappling with a lot as we work through. We were both brought on board primarily for research for the opening of our new exhibit this year, Promised Land as Proving Ground, infusing a more diverse history through Conner Prairie's grounds and experience. So over 500 years of Black history from pre-colonial Africa up to the present day in Indiana. How did Indiana serve as a proving ground for this promise made, right, to African Americans who came and settled here looking for a safe place to call their home? We knew that engaging everyone was hard. You know, we get our typical fourth graders that we adore, and we get, you know, lots of amazing families, but how are we engaging with that wider audience that maybe isn't coming here to the grounds, whether that be due to living far distances away, potentially not seeing themselves here. And so we wanted to make sure that we were giving an offering that could make people feel a part of the work we're doing here, even if they can't or don't necessarily choose to come in person.
So the podcast came together mostly because of all those reasons that Hannah had said. Also because we had seen that there was kind of a lack of a space for people in that teenage years to 20s, 20s, 30s, kind of that age group. A lot of people come to Conner Prairie because they have kids or they're history buffs or history enthusiasts, but there's just that little area where we were just wondering, like, where can we reach new people? So the new audience is there. And also we wanted to expand Conner Prairie's professional portfolio. And so getting to talk with guests and people from different historical collaboratives and different universities and from other states and getting new perspectives in on histories that we typically don't really cover. It takes a while to make an exhibit, of course, and a lot of it's a labor of love, but it takes a lot. But in some instances where we do still want to have those conversations, you can have a podcast episode about it, and we can sort of synthesize the wider conversations we want to continue having in the future and sort of get the ball rolling with that. And also for some episodes, like we have an episode out right now about William Conner. We're hoping that maybe people within the institution can use it for training purposes and stuff like that.
There we go. So that brings up the question of why problematic, right? Why this is problematic. So most of our episodes cover a very broad reach of topics, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And that is a question we get a lot, why are we tackling things in so many places? So it is all united by this idea of these are things that have been under-examined, under-discussed, and that have underlying problems that continue to affect us today. We felt like it was a through line, the research we were already doing for our upcoming exhibit, and also other areas of work that we do around the museum, where the historical arm for everything that goes on here. We were constantly stumbling across these things that had been undertold, under-examined. That's the theme really of the work that we do. And we felt that we had a unique place from which to tell it, because obviously we are a museum located here in Fishers, Indiana, but Conner Prairie has never been kind of limited in terms of scope from its founding. We have examined kind of different eras, and that's changed over time, and it's always been about telling a wider, broader story. And so we felt like we did have that place to be able to, yes, engage locally, but then also kind of zoom out and examine those national and international elements, which really brought us to this desire to make sure we were engaging with scholars at a national and international level. And we felt like, much like we heard with Talking Hoosier History, that often that historical process takes place kind of behind closed doors. People don't really know or feel comfortable with engaging with the work that we do behind the scenes. They see the output, but they don't see the input. And so our desire was really just to peel that back and say, if we are examining any topic, yeah, we might be examining it in Indiana, but there are always other elements going on. And so how do we peel that back and make sure that people are able to see the historical process and feel comfortable with engaging with it and jumping into it? So we felt like that was really our angle, and have kind of continued to run with that.
So we got our start when we were so to be honest, the idea for a podcast had been floating around in Conner Prairie for quite some time, but a lot of folks didn't know exactly who was going to take up the mantle, who got the time and the resources. And originally we were just kind of spitballing, thinking of ideas, ideas for names and what we could do and how we could get it together. And we just kind of dove in. We started looking up what are the highly recommended brands for recording, and what are the podcast do's and don'ts. Started listening to podcasts. I myself am not a podcast listener, but I've become a podcast listener now that we've of course started it. So we just kind of went through that. And originally we were talking about critiquing literature that we had at the Prairie, but then as we started to have more conversations about how big we could take this, we started to widen the lens at just targeting systemic issues that have historic origin and things like that.
So we wanted to talk a bit about the really practical hands-on, what was the experience like for us as we were working through it. We did have some amazing guidance coming from our boss, Dr. Fletcher, who has run a podcast before, or worked on a podcast before, but we really started with the basics of where will we record, how will it sound, how do we handle the equipment piece, how do we learn to edit, because we do everything from the research piece all the way through the editing process. We post ourselves, and then we work closely with the marketing team to advertise and market it. So it really is that full scope. So we had a lot of learning to do in those early days, and I'm sure you can kind of hear as the first season goes on, us kind of really getting our feet and figuring that.
Yes. So as far as the successes and challenges, one thing that I personally, had a little bit of challenge was reaching out to guests. I mean, it's easy to have someone down the hall hey, you want to talk about, you want to come on and talk about something you're passionate about, maybe rant a little bit, and we'll kind of build an episode around that. But it was different reaching out to a professional. A lot of these people are, doctors and masters in their craft, and you're reaching out to them, asking them, what we want to compensate you for your time, what is great, what we want you to fit us into your schedule. And that was just a little bit of, cold calling has never been one of my strengths. So, when you're reaching out to these people, you're always afraid of rejection. And we have reached out to some people that have just not gotten back with us. And, over time, you just kind of come to expect that everyone's busy. And, there are some instances where people will say, like, you might want to up that honorarium a little bit. And we're more than happy to make sure people feel, that we value their input and we value their time. And also editing, I myself am not, we're actually on an Apple computer right now. I've never had an Apple computer, so getting to know the new software on an Apple computer has also been a little bit of a challenge. But editing I don't know, it was hard, but then it kind of became therapeutic almost. Like I really enjoy, changing stuff around and making it sound good. So, but that was just, again, it's a lot of trial and error. You just have to kind of feel it out as opposed to watching a ton of tutorials online. Yeah. I
think there have obviously been challenges in each of those areas like you're addressing, but and then the successes of kind of that learning process coming to fruition. We've also finally started to see people starting to reach out to us about coming on and talking with us. So that has felt like a massive win a year in of really having people take an interest and start to engage back. We've had a lot of conversations will start when we have guests in. And so that's where you start to see those repeat guests like David Highway, who comes in quite frequently because they have the expertise in a lot of the things that we're interested in talking about, but they also kind of present topics. And so it has really built, it feels like we've got to a point where we've really built a nice little community, and we're excited for that to continue to expand. And I think I would encourage anyone that can be a wonderful thing, both personally as historians, but then also for institutions, that this work can be a wonderful way of building bridges. And obviously we would always be willing to go out and speak for others too. And it can build that really nice cooperative relationship where sometimes we're in our kind of silos in different museums or institutions. And this can kind of be a lovely way of breaking down some of those barriers. One of the things we really struggled with this first year was the challenge of what do we have our schedule look like? When do we post? How do we handle timing? How many episodes do we put out? Because we have kind of taken on podcasting as an additional responsibility, as like a lot of places are, you have your kind of your main responsibility, but you kind of pick up extra things. So the podcast has become an extra piece for us. And so we've really ended up at the point we're moving into season 2 now. And we've changed our schedule quite dramatically. We did 12 episodes last year, and we were trying to kind of release weekly, and it was a lot. We were going to kind of do these seasonal setups of like spring and fall, having 12 weeks where we're putting out an episode a week. And it did put a lot of pressure on both ourselves and then our guests as well, that we were needing to get people so quickly. It's not super realistic. So going into it, we would encourage thinking about giving yourself that space from the beginning to put out the highest quality you possibly can. We're really excited heading into season 2. We're putting out one a month. And we're following the academic calendar because the majority of our guests are academics. And so thinking about the schedules that the people you want to speak with might have, any events that they might have in their calendar, that can be really, really helpful. And then we're also recording quite a few upfront this time and then posting slowly. And so that's made a huge difference too. Marketing has also definitely been a challenge. It's quite different from how you market in-person events, and the way that people engage is quite different. We've had a really great series of interviews and stuff these last few months within local press. And so I would definitely say, as you get started, it has stunned us how interested local papers, local TV channels and stuff have actually been. I don't think either of us expected that. And so I would say, as hard as it can be, have confidence in reaching out and letting people know the work that you're doing.
You want to start with highlights?
Yeah, I can start highlights. So we just wanted to put on a few highlights of the first year to give people some inspiration of like some of the exciting things that can happen. So obviously we had that media work that went on that's been really successful, has really increased our downloads. You can see that rapid jump in the download rate that is as a direct result of the kind of work we've been doing with local media. And from a lot of the people that we've talked to, we were at the American Association of Historians conference in January, talking with people who have been doing this podcasting work for a long time. And that plus articles and things we've read, 10,000 downloads is a pretty good reaching point. Because that's really when marketing and advertisers start to get interested. And so we're really excited that we've hit almost half of that in the first kind of 8 to 9 months. So that's kind of an idea of where it's taken us and potentially kind of where things can take yourselves. Do you want to talk about the awards and things?
Sure. Yeah. So we received an award, an internal award. We also got an award from Indiana Humanities. So we really appreciated that, and we received an award at the end of last year for the what's that award considered? The values team. Yes, the values team. So we were told that we embodied the values of Conner Prairie. So ours was heart for the past, head for the present, eyes to the future. Ours was head to the present, correct? Okay, yes. So we received the grant, the award for our eye to the future as well. And we also are happy to say that we have reached over 22 countries. So in addition to the United States, there's 21 other countries where people have downloaded our podcasts. So that was pretty huge, and it's kind of a surprise to me, especially because we haven't done any international pushing. So it was just us being found by people on different parts of the world. So that was crazy, but pleasant surprise.
As much fun as it is to kind of just be excited about those things as well, we kind of wanted to highlight them because I think they're useful for other people thinking about starting podcasts, that the awards have really helped us reach a new point and being able to pay others for their time and their labor. Especially as Dr. Marino was talking about, there is this challenge of, if you're telling more diverse stories, which is something we are also always looking to do, you are asking people for their emotional labor. And so the awards have been really helpful in upping the amount that we can offer people. And generally, we're paying about 500, I think has been kind of between 250 and 500 per episode. But like Easton said earlier, we're always willing to kind of discuss with people how they feel like their time and labor should be accounted for, and how we can help with that. And we always make sure we let people promote their work when they come on, to try and make sure that it is a reciprocal process. And we like to always have an end point of the podcast be further work that we would encourage people to do. How are people engaging in their communities? And so we've had guests also say that that's a piece that they like, is that they feel like it's kind of furthering, we're all kind of working together to further different missions as well as our own. And I think the international piece is really cool, because we were talking about, obviously one of the main goals of the podcast in the beginning was to reach audiences we don't reach. A lot of these people are never going to physically be able to visit. They may never have heard of Conner Prairie in Indiana, but now they have, and now they're engaging with us in this way. And so it has been a really cool thing to see the scope that we can have that we could never have without the podcast.
Mm-hmm. So planning for season 2, we have some great ideas for some episodes. We want to talk about museum accessibility. We want to talk about some of the myths surrounding not just the history of Indiana, but also the history of our country. So we're going to tackle the myth of the pioneer, the whole image of the wilderness had been untouched and all that stuff. But we know from history that's not true in most cases. Of course, the native nations have been here before the pioneers even got there. So we're talking about that. Also, the myth of the North versus the South in the Civil War. There was plenty of systemic prejudices in the North as well as the South. And so we're going to talk about that. And just, historical curiosities too. Our first episode in season 2 is talking about a saloon smashing that took place in Westfield. So, talking about history in Indiana, but also how that ties into the national issues of the time, like temperance and prohibition. And so we have some high, some really fun stuff coming, and also some high expectations. We think that 10,000 downloads by the end of the year is definitely within our sights.
Yeah, we're excited about that. So we wanted to put down a few kind of recommendations. We've kind of talked about stuff throughout this presentation, but I think the biggest thing that we would encourage people if they're thinking about starting up a podcast, we completely echo what we're talking about with Talking Hoosier History, making sure that it fits with the mission and the vision and that there's a purpose. I think also one thing we would add is just making sure you have a passion for the topic, that you enjoy talking about it, because I do think that really comes through. One of our most listened to episode really surprised us. It's been our one with Dr. Fletcher at the end of the season, all about Sesame Street. And I think it was because we were having fun and really engaging and enjoying, as well as tackling an important topic. So there's that. I think also setting realistic expectations. I think a lot of people come into this process, we did, not necessarily knowing like what to expect from a podcast, what reach is realistic, what marketing goals are realistic. And so in us trying to figure that out, it has been a process of kind of communicating that with others too, of like, this is what's normal for podcasting sphere, because it can be quite different than other forms of media. And then finally is if you can find grant money, or you can find money from inside the budget, which obviously always nonprofits, state-led institutions, these things is a challenge, but if you can invest in some good equipment up front, it does make a huge difference. Our software, we use Adobe to edit, and that has made a world of difference compared to some of the free softwares we kind of played around with in the beginning. So if you are able to use those kind of slightly more expensive but slightly higher quality software, it can make a world of difference in your process.
I think that's all.
Thank you guys so much for
Thank
listening.
you. Yes, thank you so much.
I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you all so very, very much. I do have a question since we have reached the Q&A portion. And for those of you, if you need to hop off, we certainly understand. But if you can hang on, you're welcome to ask a few questions from our presenters. Something I think many of us are wondering, where would you look for grants to fund a start for a podcast?
I guess I can start with that. We actually have done this on a $0 budget, essentially. We had a little bit of money up front to just buy some equipment, like a decent recorder and microphone, headphones, those types of things. But so I can't say that I recommend a particular grant or anything, but I know that they are out there, certainly. There's a lot of humanities type grants, even NEH type grants that are for digital technology or digital history, production type grants, technology type grants. There are grants from the state too, LSTA grants. So they're out there. You just have to be creative and see about what are the matching costs or what returns are expected from that. So I don't know, Hannah and Easton, if you all have applied for any. We have not necessarily, but there are technology grants out there that I think fit well for history programming.
Yeah, we're really lucky. We have a grant team, a couple of people internally who do a lot of work for the institution in that way. And so they worked really closely with us to help build the grants that we applied for at the end of last year. But I know that Indiana Humanities one I don't believe it had a matching, and it was about $3,500 that they had on the table. So certainly Indiana Humanities was great. One that we spoke with at AHA that they were saying they often do is the Roy Rosenwitz Center. They have some, and then like you talked about, National Humanities, those are obviously sometimes harder to acquire, but yeah, there are different granting institutions. Can you think of any others locally that we engaged with?
Not at present, no.
No, I think that's a good. I just noticed Jeanette put in the chat as well about time producing. So we could definitely speak a little bit from that too. How much time do you spend producing one episode from beginning to end, including research? What do you think?
Research, we usually do probably up to a week, if not more, of research before we, and it's not necessarily adding to the document, but it's synthesizing as much as we can from just general stuff, comparing primary and secondary sources, and then writing out the bits that we'll use in the episode. And some of those questions get left because there's simply just not enough time, because when you're tackling so much stuff, you can only fit so much. Our episodes are about an hour, some a little bit more, some a little bit less, and there's only so much you can tackle in that time. But from that, I would say like a week preparation probably takes us an hour to to record, maybe an hour to set up and get and then tear down, and then editing is probably like a day or two.
Yeah, and I would say it's important that we split the labor. Obviously, the two of us are on the team, so I would say if we're saying a week to research, it's probably a couple of hours a day on separate from, and often it interconnects with things we're already working on. So I think when we did our application for the internal grant, I think we said we spend about 10 to 15 hours per episode. Total was about our estimate. Some more, some less, but that was about our estimate between us. We spend about that amount of time.
Yeah, I can jump in on that too. Like we used to have a very strict production schedule, but like Hannah and Easton were both saying too, like over years ago, like that is just not realistic in terms of sticking to this. But what we've done over the last couple of years is when we've been releasing somewhere between 6 to 10 episodes a season, depending, that's gone up and down, and then COVID sort of threw the wrench into everything too. But we were working on 6 to 8 week production schedules. And so we had already done research for the episodes, because again, I was saying those were coming from our markers or from our blogs or from other things. So we would consider the research being done by the time we just went to the podcast, but we would write a script, and that would usually take a couple weeks because Lindsay Beckley, who used to be our main host before she left for another position, was modifying blog posts, modifying this other research that we had in writing a script, coming up with a hook on both ends, and parceling in the relevance and other things. But even that, we would then have we'd have a meeting with the team to give feedback on that script. And we usually had 1 or 2 meetings on the script itself. And then she would have to go out and find, okay, well, I don't have a primary source here, or I need to find a newspaper article that talks about this. So that would usually take like another week. So we'd have, writing the script could be a couple weeks in itself. And then we would do a read through, bring in another employee who didn't even know what we were doing the episode on, so they could hear it fresh and give feedback just about like the wording and anything that we might have missed, because we had already been invested in it. And then we do the recording, and that would take a couple of days usually. And I say that not that they're recording for 8 hours, but because they're also doing all the other things that, this is one sliver too of many people's jobs. And so, but we'd give a couple of days for Lindsay or Justin or whomever was doing that particular episode to finish recording. And then I wanted Jill to have usually 7 to 10 days to do the editing, because I'm sure Hannah and Easton, this too, like if you're sitting down to do it, you can't just do that for hours on end. It's a lot to listen and to tweak. And Jill, luckily, and this is where I feel like we have been very lucky from the beginning, Jill is a musician and already knows a lot about like sound production and editing. And so she also just came to us with those skills, which we're very lucky to have. But that can take, I mean, hours upon hours. This is where I wish she was here to give you a more in-depth answer about that. But so I'm babbling, but in terms of overall production, it takes us 6 to 8 weeks from beginning to end till we're ready to release. Again, not everybody working on that all day long, but a lot longer than one would think for on our end is a 20 to 30 minute episode for the main narrative Talking Hoosier History episodes.
Oh, Molly, you need to unmute. We couldn't hear you. Oh, still can't hear you, Molly.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm Molly Head. I'm with Hoosier History Live. We started out as a radio show, gosh, I don't know, a long time ago, 14 years ago. And what we do is we just take our live with call-in radio show, and then it's an hour long now, and then we do put it on podcast. We do some minor editing, but that's what we do. I've tried a jillion different ways to like partner with other organizations, institutions, and after countless vain attempts, I've decided it's easiest just to run the project as a small business by myself using my own organizational and management skills. So that's what I do. And my question is counting the number of downloads, is that the main way that people, I guess, understand the measure the value of a podcast? Or, I mean, this is all new to us, and we're kind of the old people, although we have, thank goodness, young people among our team members, thank goodness. But my basic question is, do you measure for number of downloads?
Yeah, Molly, hi, it's nice to see you again. I know Casey's coming on the program tomorrow, I think.
Yes, yeah, she's our road tripper.
Yeah, we do measure via downloads, but I also know that we are not consistent on that, and it definitely corresponds to when we have a new release, and then you'll see numbers spike, obviously, for a little while for new downloads, but then there's sort of like a second base level where we want to be consistent. So we haven't released a new episode for a month or two, but are those numbers then staying for sort of repeat people like downloading other episodes? So that's our main measure, but partly because I'm also super jealous after hearing Easton and Hannah talk about marketing. Like, we don't have any marketing budget. So there's no way for us other than our own social media, which we do promote our podcast there too. And we will get comments perhaps on social media if people go through that to find the podcast about what they thought about the episode, but we don't have a lot of other measures, unfortunately, in terms of feedback to knowing what the reach is on it, other than through our social media and through the download numbers. So I think there are other ways that folks can glean information about the success of it, but just in terms of like how many people we're reaching, that's the number that we look at.
Well, thanks. And I want to say, I think the Historical Bureau, I think your content just rocks. It's amazing what you all do, what you come up with. And I also want to thank you. I found there's so much, fiefdom, and it seems like in the history community, so many organizations have their own, thing, and you can't trust anyone else and that kind of thing. And so I don't like that. I think learning is very exciting. And so Michelle, it's good to see you bringing all these different people together for this Zoom session. So thank you. That's all.
For the compliments, we appreciate it. And we always enjoy working with you all too, so.
Okay. Well, let's see, we have gone over, and I appreciate all of our speakers for hanging in there. And I also want to thank all of our participants for hanging in there. We certainly appreciate your time. We'd like to know how you thought we did today. So we will be, we will be putting a survey link into the chat if you would like to let us know how you thought today went. And also if you have suggestions for future sessions for our Aim to Connect. We do Aim to Connect sessions every other month. Our next one will be on Friday, May 26th. Our Aim to Connect will be imagining a virtual museum, and we'll be discussing 3D mapping. You can also catch us this July at the Association of Midwest Museums annual meeting that will be hosted here in Indianapolis. But then also, if you do have additional questions for any of our speakers, we have put their emails also in the chat, and hopefully everybody can see this, I'm not sure, but you can connect. We have provided the emails for all of our speakers. So again, Michelle, Hannah, Easton, thank you so much for presenting today on behalf of the Association of Indiana Museums. Thank you so much.